Well, you know, there's a lot of things we can be doing this time of the season out in our garden. And you know, sometimes we think that spring will never get here. Certainly the last few weeks that we've had of this late winter weather. But there are a lot of things we can be doing. And one of the things we should be doing right now is doing some maintenance on that asparagus bed. Asparagus is really a good crop for the garden, particularly if you have room for it. It's a crop that's very low in fat and high in nutrition, a real delicacy in the garden. And it's really fairly easy to grow once you get the bed established, but there is a certain amount of early season maintenance we need to do on that. And right now we need to be looking at cutting down those asparagus ferns. You see we had a lot of fern growth last year after the harvest season. We need to leave those ferns on all winter long for some protection, but before the new asparagus spears start coming out, now's the time to get rid of those and do a little bit of maintenance. So today we're knocking down these with a rake. They really come down fairly easily this time of the year because they're pretty dry. And after we've done that, just to make it somewhat easier, I'll get my loppers and continue to cut off those tops that may be left, just to make it easier for a little bit of maintenance later when we begin to put down some fertilizer and till that into the soil. Now it's also very important that we get rid of all this old residue, get it out of the garden, because the asparagus ferns are a good place to harbor diseases, particularly has some asparagus rust. You may see some overwintering insects on there too. Asparagus beetle is one insect we're concerned about. And also even squash bugs, if you have those in your garden, they're always looking for a place to sort of overwinter. So there's a variety of insects that could be overwintering. So we want to get those out of the garden and get rid of them. After we have got our ferns knocked off and the rest of the tops cut down, we'll go ahead and rake just a little bit more to get some more of that residue off of the bed. That'll make it a little bit easier for us to come in and see what we're doing. See, one of the reasons that we want to do this and clean this up also is because already you can begin to see that we've got some winter weeds coming up in here. Because there has been some protection here, and because it's been fairly moist, and we've not had some of those really cold freezing spells that have got down quite so bad under this residue, those early weeds are coming up. Two of the things that we want to really consider at this time of the year for asparagus is what is the pH of the soil, and also to maintain some soil fertility. Asparagus really likes a pH that is slightly acid. So if your soil, particularly in eastern Oklahoma, is begun to get too acid, down say below 6.2 or 6, or if you have compost on there and that's created acidity, you want to come in and lime a little bit at this time of the year. Excuse me. But also, you'll want to be sure, first of all, to have a soil test, because we don't want to get too much lime on there. Now is also the time to fertilize. We're going to use just about a 10-20-10 or a 1-2-1 fertilizer, lightly scattered over the top of the asparagus bed at a rate of about 1/2 of a pound per 100 square feet. Asparagus are not real heavy feeders, but yet on the other hand, they do require a soil that will be somewhat maintained as far as an even nutrient supply is concerned. And I like to just broadcast it over the top, and then if we have put lime on there, the lime can go on at the same time. And it is then important that we incorporate this into the soil a little bit just to get the fertilizer activated, but more importantly, to break this top of the soil up, get some of those weeds down in there that are those weeds that have come up back into the soil or are tilled up a little bit, so we'll have some early weed control through that. And then also break the crust on the soil, if there is a crust, to allow those asparagus spears to start coming through. So there's a lot of things we can do to the asparagus bed now to maintain it. And we're going to go into some other areas of the garden and do a few other tips for you now, some other things while I'm asking Steve to go ahead and till this in for us. After we till it in, then Steve will come back and do some mulching, because once we've tilled the asparagus, I like to put a light mulch over it, maybe ground leaves, pine straw, sawdust, cottonseed hulls, whatever mulch you may have at your disposal, for a couple of reasons. That will help us keep the early weed growth down, but also if you ever have asparagus spears that come up through clean soil, you know how dirty those can be right after a rain. So this will help keep those spears clean. So while Steve is doing this, we're going to go over and do some other things in the garden on early garden maintenance. Well, although Steve was using the small Manus tiller to till our fertilizer into the asparagus bed, a small tiller isn't really necessary, although it is of course helpful, particularly if you have a large bed. But just a heavy garden rake, a hand tiller, anything that can incorporate that into 1 or 2 inches deep is fine. One thing we want to be sure and do again is do this asparagus maintenance early enough in the season before those spears start coming up, because you don't want to get so deep that you damage those early emerging spears. Well, now is the time to plant asparagus in the garden, and many times people want to start their asparagus at the time of harvest because that's when they really think about it. That's too late, actually. So right now is the time to do it. Anytime between now and actually late March is a good time to plant asparagus. We'll start our asparagus by the planting of what's called an asparagus crown. These are available at your local garden center or at your farm supply store. Asparagus likes to have a well-drained, loamy soil, although they will do fairly well in a heavier type soil, particularly if you watch your organic matter content in that soil. Be sure that asparagus is well exposed to full light and to sun. They really prefer a full day sun, but at least a half a day of sun, and more it would even be better, is necessary for them. Work the asparagus row very well. Be sure that all residue and organic matter and compost is well incorporated into the soil, that you're free of any perennial type weeds. And I always like to put asparagus at one part of the garden with maybe other perennial crops because it is a perennial. And a well-managed, well-maintained asparagus bed will provide asparagus for you for 15 or 20 years or perhaps even longer. Asparagus crowns are planted, although they look a little bit like a spider actually, they're planted with the roots spread out, usually about 6 to 8 inches deep within the row. The soil is then gradually brought over the asparagus spears as they begin to emerge, and so the asparagus then will start emerging well in the early spring, particularly when we start getting warm days in April and in May, and you'll see some good growth on that asparagus. We shouldn't harvest the asparagus the first year or two. We want all that fern to grow up so that it can produce food in the roots for the crowns for next year. But those are just some really quick tips on planting asparagus to remind you now that this is the time to do it. You can get detailed information on asparagus planting through your local county extension office or by contacting us on our website at Oklahoma Gardening. We hope that you enjoy asparagus in your own garden if you have it. And if you don't have asparagus and you have the room, I would really encourage you to grow some. Actually, it makes a pretty nice ornamental plant. Asparagus fern is very attractive as it grows up in the summertime along a fence or along the back of a perennial or an annual bed. It makes a really good background. So maybe you'll want to try asparagus in your garden.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.